All right, so you may have noticed in the fourth video, the one I just completed, I actually forgot to talk about the other two multipliers. So in chapter 9, in the Keynesian, so I'm continuing my Keynesian for a little bit, and then we'll go to the classical school. So there's more than just a spending multiplier, right? Chapter 9 talks about a spending multiplier, a tax multiplier, and then a balanced budget multiplier. And I'm going to give you sort of the punchline to the joke, okay? This is the easiest, kind of quickest way to do it. And it starts with your spending multiplier. As you know, your spending multiplier is 1 over NPS, right? And we talked about the concept of the spending multiplier already. So again, a dollar injected into an economy reverberates and has a bigger impact than simply a dollar. Okay, so if I give you an MPC of 0.8, right? Your MPS is going to be 0.2, and your spending multiplier would be what? Well, 1 divided by 0.2 is going to be 5, right? So far, so good. We've talked about that before. The easiest way to just understand or get the tax multiplier in the balanced budget is your tax multiplier is always 1 less and negative from your spending multiplier. So what's 1 less and negative than 5? Negative 4. All right, and your balanced budget multiplier is always 1. Okay, so that's the easiest way. So let's play a game. Let's say my spending multiplier was 10. What would the tax multiplier be? Right, it's going to be negative 9. What would the balanced budget multiplier be? 1, because it's always 1. Okay, so what if my spending multiplier is 9? Then the tax would be negative 8, balanced budget would be 1. Okay, so you get that. Now, let's see how this works. Let's say I go through and I have a gap to close. So I've got another recessionary gap, and this gap right here is 40, I don't know, we'll stick with billion, $40 billion. Now, using these multipliers, how would I close that gap? Well, if I got a gap of 40 to close and my spending multiplier is 5, then what times 5 equals 40? Obviously, 8 is the answer. Okay, so what I could do is to close this gap, I could either increase government spending by $8 billion, or using the tax multiplier, if I have a $40 billion gap and the tax multiplier is negative 4, what times negative 4 is going to equal 40? 10. So what that means is I could either increase government spending by $8 billion, or I could lower taxes by $10 billion. Or in the case of the balanced budget multiplier, I could increase both government spending and taxes by the $40 billion and close it that way. But here's the point, the part I want you to be sure you know. Be sure you know how to calculate those three. So if I give you a spending multiplier or the data like a MPS or MPC to calculate a spending multiplier, be sure you know how to calculate all that. Okay? All right. That wraps up the Keynesian. Now let's look at the classical response. As you recall, pure classical economics believes in a laissez-faire form of government intervention, which is to say none, right? So the government should keep out of it and keep a hands-off approach and let the government or the economy kind of sort itself out. So part of the in the classical school, I think I covered this, but just so we're clear, right? So in the classical school, that's a recessionary gap, right? What would the classical response be? Do nothing, because in the long run, that is going to fix itself, right? This is self-correcting economy, and I already explained that in an earlier video. Here's the point I'm making, though. Which one of those three things shifts in the classical school? Well, short-run aggregate supply is what shifts to bring an economy back into to equilibrium, right? Which is why the classical or neoclassical school or economists are oftentimes called supply side, right? Because it's short-run aggregate supply in their model or in their view that shifts. Okay, so what's one of the things that helps shift short-run aggregate supply to the right like that? Lower taxes. So when you start talking about supply-side economists or supply-side economics, there's a couple of hallmarks, right? One of them is lower taxes, and that helps explain part of what you've seen, recently with the Trump administration, right? Another thing is that, again, we talked about the fact that the focus is all about shifting short-run aggregate supply, and one effective way of doing that in their model is by lowering taxes. And then the final kind of component when you start talking about supply-side economists is sort of incentives. So incentives to work, incentives to be productive, and etc. That's sort of a quick and dirty on the supply side. The one supply side kind of economist. Whoops! I dropped my pen. One guy I want to talk about, though, is Arthur Laffer. So Art Laffer, this is a great story, was out to dinner. This is during the Reagan administration, right? So was out to dinner with some members of the Reagan administration. I don't recall who, maybe Casper Weinberg or something like that. Anyway, so they're talking about taxes and the effectiveness of taxes and the whole bit. And what he just took out a cocktail napkin. And he was like, well, here it is. Let me explain it to you. And he drew something that looks like this. Notice when you have a recessionary gap, okay? And if your response is to shift aggregate demand, which is a very Keynesian thing to do, right? Increases in government spending or et cetera, and your aggregate demand shifts there to bring the economy back into equilibrium, the supply side guys said, well, yeah, but what you're doing is creating a lot of inflation, right? Because remember, this is price level, and if you go from a price level here to a price level here, what is a persistent increase in price level called? Inflation. And in fact, during the late 70s, early 80s, when inflation was running kind of rampant, that was sort of their argument. Of course, the response to the Keynesians was to say, well, okay, then we'll just redraw and make aggregate or short-run aggregate supply horizontal. That way, with subsequent increases in aggregate demand, there's no increase. And, I guess you can write anything on a whiteboard if it's free. So I hope that helps.